მოდი ბიჭო გავაგოროთ ხომარი კუკიაზე ეკლესია რომ არის იქ დაფდება ქურდი ბიჭი ომარი ნახალოკის ხომარ ბასი რომ არის იქ დაფდება ქურდი ბიჭი ომარი ნახალოკის ხომარ ბასი რომ არის კამათელი გავაგორე დაჭდა თუბარა სვისი ფული დაქონება სხვამ ჩაიბარა კამათელი გავაგორე დაჭდა თუბეში სვისი ფული დაქონება ჩადის უბეში კამათელი გავაგორე დაჭდა თუბარა ჩემი ფული დაქონება სხვამ ჩაიბარა კამათელი გავაგორე დაჭდა თუბეში
Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. I'm Sopo.
And I'm Brian.
Today we will be discussing the Moldovan elections. We have our special guest from Moldova, Vitalie Sprînceană.
My name is Vitalie Sprînceană. I'm a Moldovan and Chisinau-based sociologist, journalist, activist, and a lot of other things that are kind of labels, but they also help me survive in a way, so I keep them dearly.
Great. I read your recent piece on the Moldovan elections. I posted on Twitter. I thought it was funny. People were like, "We're getting all this information about Moldova from your account," and I was like, "Oh God," because I don't know that much about Moldova. I was like, "Just read Vitalie's article," and so one really wonderful thing when we were discussing Georgian elections on your show, we realized we had so much in common about the same narratives, same kind of culture wars, and the way politics is being shaped. So I'm very, very excited to have you on today. I've also known Vitalie for many years, and I'm so happy he's here. Okay, so I'll start with maybe the first question. Brian, elections were something between the West or EU and Russia, and that the EU was victorious. And so everyone, and I see like literally massive, effort by a lot of, let's say on social media, pretty much describing the elections in these terms, that the EU has won in Moldova and Russia was defeated again and Putin was defeated again. And even our Georgian president said, Russia loses everywhere. It's losing in Ukraine. It just lost in Moldova and it will lose in Georgia. So I know you hate this framework as much as I do. So maybe you can give us a snapshot of how you actually see the elections.
Thank you for inviting me again. And I've been following this narrative. It not only annoys me, but it also, how to put it, I think it's becoming a barrier, a difficulty. It's not just an irony. It's not something that is funny. It's really becoming a political kind of argument that gets in the way of doing like basic things, like discussing what is the situation in your country. So it's becoming a zombie kind of category that is being applied uncritically. I don't know what you were doing in Georgia, but we've been saving the West since 2009, if I remember correctly. All the elections that we have had, they were about the same, saving somehow the West, which is so powerful, so dominating, so hegemonic. But somehow Moldova, this little country which barely stands and it's so fragile, somehow it succeeds to save it time and time again, which is, and I think maybe our like the generations that will come, maybe will find that this funny. Maybe we'll think like, oh, these people could not see that this is really kind of a joke or something that they're telling. Didn't they see the absurdity of it? And powerful groups that are interested in this narrative and in pushing it, because in this way you are excused of not talking about, like, for example, the material conditions of the people, about the things that happen internally, about the abuses of the government, about how the government does not do its job, how people kind of see that their basic everyday conditions of life are deteriorating, and everything is kind of put under this huge umbrella. We're saying the Western civilization, we have to choose between the East and the West. And it, in a way, it kind of takes away the voice from you, because you don't have the possibility, the capacity, the right even to express some criticism, because you have to save that Western civilization. You have to do your choice is something more. And you're always kind of being called to kind of silence your criticism and say, like, let's say first the country in the West, and then we'll discuss somewhere later. And I think it's becoming toxic. It's becoming problematic. It's making all the discussions almost impossible. And it's also very convenient for the governments to use that, especially when these lenses are being applied not only by the government, for example, but also by powerful international actors like Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, the State Department. Everybody is saying the same. So when these give these signals, like, you feel powerless in your country to kind of to elaborate some alternative narratives. And also, how to put it, it's becoming, because of this, it's becoming increasingly not only difficult to kind of act politically, to build up an alternative politics, but even to kind of resist sometimes, because these narratives are very powerful. They mobilize forces that and they, I don't know how to put it, but it's they kind of frame social questions into cultural issues, into geopolitical issues, and that kind of sweeps away years and years of efforts of organizing, of kind of talking about economies. It kind of also groups people in different ways, and sometimes, and like, this is the cleverness, the genius of this argument, is that it convinces people to vote against their interest with forces that are against their interest, and like convinces them, like, you have to forget these grievances, this and that. You have to unite in around something which is very abstract, and or sometimes is very concrete, against your neighbor that has a different view. So this argument, I see it, I used to treat it as a joke. I used to understand in a way that journalism in the West and everywhere is like in a really bad shape, because lacks funding, lacks permanent correspondence in various places, people that are being paid either to stay or to kind of follow the developments in some countries and to really kind of understand what's happening. And I used to make jokes of this. I used to think that it's kind of out of laziness, but I see it now as a powerful argument that distorts the local reality, that constructs a powerful narrative that goes against everything that's happening on the ground, and there's a barrier for us, because it really prevents and hinders our discussion locally. You cannot discuss like social policy, salaries, wages, pensions, minimum existence, like unions and so on, because you have to fight with Russia and everything. It's funny. It used to be really a joke. The mayor of Chisinau in around 2013, 2014, like, instead, like at the local elections, he was arguing, like, let's not focus on the streets, on the fact that the pavement is bad, that for example, all this heating system is from the Soviet era and it blows. We had streets collapsing, basically street collapsing, and the car being kind of sucked in this. And like he said, like, no, let's not argue that we're now fighting. We have to fight Russia. And it's crazy.
Actually, a really incredible way of putting it. Really liked that, how it's really a barrier to understanding. It's no longer a joke. I 100% agree with that. I think you articulated that so well. So why do you think, maybe before we go into the elections, why do you think voices like yours, even mine, right, are so marginalized. And even if we create spaces, like I've created space to speak that wasn't given to me, that I sort of clawed my way into. Why do you think that Western press, it seems mostly, and maybe also Russians maybe say the same thing. I don't speak Russian, so I don't follow it as closely. So I could be wrong. Why do you think we are not given any space to even discuss these things in a more in-depth way, and why we're also made to be called like Putinists? So if you try to actually discuss like any kind of outside of the narrative, then you're called somehow a useful idiot, a KGB, Putinist, pro-Russia, tanky, whatever. So why do you think that is?
Cannot judge about your context, but I can very much say about my context. And I think it's kind of our positioning for them is very weird, because it's kind of outside this binary scheme where you have like pro-Russians clearly and pro-Europeans that are pro-Europeans like that religiously. We sometimes say it's like a cargo cult. So this is one thing. The other thing is that we're critical, and we, at least in Moldova, we also have created this space for ourselves. It's not that we just like say like we created this online platform of our Platforma, and we said like this, look, it's us, we are standing for this and these values. And we had hatred from both sides, from the so-called left in Moldova, which is the pro-Russian kind of political spectrum, and from others. And I think for both of them were a pain in that organ that cannot be said on live broadcast because of several reasons. For the so-called pro-Russians, we are an indicator or a model where you can, for example, in relationship, we'll probably talk about it later in more details, but for example, our pro-Russian, but really explicitly pro-Russian political forces, they have they idealize the Soviet past. They say everything was good, including Stalin and everything. And we say like, no, let's have a discussion about that. Let's talk about the modernization project contained in the Soviet system. Let's talk critically about repression, state violence, and so on. So for them, this is a very inconvenient way of talking. For the others, they perceive us as Democrats in their minds. And for them, what is problematic is that we are truly Democrats, because we really, as an anarchist, I really care about democracy. I really care about like solidarity. I really care about like non-hierarchical forms of discussion, dialogue, large participation, consensus. And for them, which like for these people that understood that sometimes this liberal game is just a game, like when they see people like us that say like, look, you have to be truthful at least to your values, for them that's also very inconvenient. So I think for the so-called Europeans perceive us as an internal critique, and they don't like us because they think that they are only force of progressivism or whatever. So I think that, and also we are talking about topics that are very, very, very inconvenient for them, and they're gladly keeping us like low or marginalizing us because we're dangerous, because we make the connections in other ways than they want, for example. And that's also, at least we are not a real political force, but we can participate in these kind of discursive battles where like we can say and we can argue that the rhetoric of European integration has been used to, for example, to hide or to mask some really bad authoritarian practices that are just like you can name it, or that it has been used in order to promote some very toxic policies, or like we're saying that their economic policies of favoring the investors are really harming the workers. And for them, this is very annoying, and it's annoying because it's true. So they will gladly marginalize us. And of course, we don't participate in this game of like, let's divide the world in between like the good and the bad, and the good is unconditionally the West and the bad is unconditionally the East, and we're really rejecting this whole game. And for them, we're a reminder that another political discourse, another political discussion is possible. So I think this is the reason that they not only don't like us, they hate us, but then they have to somehow accept us because we play their game in many ways. We're playing multiple games, but we're playing also their games, like participating in public discussions, in the media articles, social media. So I think they hate us for us being so resilient, because we've been kind of passing through a lot of these waves of hatred in the beginning, where we said, like, we're some people that we believe in this and that and that. And we just mentioned like leftism, leftist socialism, equality, social justice, and like, you are for the Gulag, you are for the Gulag, you are for Stalin. No, we're not. But who you are? Because either you are pro this, pro Stalin, or you have to be pro-European integration. I'm neither of this. And there have been other successive waves, and we kind of resist. That's kind of the story. And I think this is another reason for them to marginalize us.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about how you connect the dots in a different way, I think that's such a beautiful way of putting it. Because it's similar here in Georgia as well. It's like, you know, there's an attempt to say, like, we'll say problems of immigration, right? Immigration, destruction of family, right? So the opposition parties will try to portray this as the failings of the government, even though it was actually accelerated by EU integration, and visa-free travel is why so many people have left. And then the government will, through all these like other conservative forces before, will translate this into a sort of pro-family, anti-sexual minorities. So it's this like, neither of them are willing to actually look at the material basis for why there is a destruction of family, and people are yearning for that kind of, you know, a golden age. It might not have existed, but, you know, in their minds of sort of when families used to be whole and everyone was in the same place, and you didn't have your mother working for 15 years in Italy. So it's like these things that are really inconvenient. And I find it very difficult because it's sort of like trying to get your, you know, when they say like, get your product out there, right? It's like you have to have like people who buy these products, to put it in these very harsh capitalist terms. And because they're both being tilted in these two different ways, then people think that you're somehow untrustworthy, because sometimes some things they think, oh, this person is correct. And then they hear your other thoughts and like, oh, this person is totally saying something I don't disagree with. So then they think you're not a trustworthy source because they don't understand your worldview, because it is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so we have this constant problem with that.
So maybe now is a good time to ask the question about the recent referendum in Moldova on the European Union. I think this would be very interesting for our listeners, because as you know, in Georgia in 2018, there was a constitutional amendment passed by the current actually ruling party alongside NGOs, Article 78, which says that the Georgian government has a constitutional obligation to pursue joining NATO and the European Union. So for our listeners, could you just like outline the context of this EU referendum in Moldova, which was voted on, and if I remember correctly, won by a very narrow margin? So what were the, you know, debates about it? Why was it put forward, and what does it mean in your view?
Well, to provide you some context, the referendum was held on 20th of October. But the idea of the referendum was advanced in December 2023. And it was announced at the same time, the referendum was announced at the same time as the election, as the intention of Maia Sandu, the current president, to run for a second mandate. So I immediately said when that became known that the two things are connected. And I had several arguments, and these are still valid arguments, so I wanted to mention them. So one of the arguments, I think, is that there was nothing and I'll probably repeat myself in the sense that I've written and I've said that also in other places, but there is really nothing going on right now between Moldova and EU that would need popular or kind of approval. There is no association agreement, there is no accession treaty, there is nothing that is really something huge and needs to be dealt right now, and the people of Moldova have to express their opinion. More than that, Moldova has started the relations with the EU a long time ago, and already, if, for example, if you would argue that EU integration means kind of completely transforming the country, and this is a thing that needs to be decided by the citizens, it started a long time ago, and it's an ongoing process. It's happening right now, and it's so many documents that were so important. Moldova, in a way, lives by European rules in many areas, starting from intellectual property, some technical regulations, some like the legal system. A lot of things are really happening according to this EU legislation. So it's already there. And also we had already kind of even the formal reason of kind of doing the referendum to put the EU integration in the constitution. I think it's kind of an extra. It's something that was unnecessary. Let's put it this way, because it's there in the legislation. There is a law that won the overwhelming support. There is a decision by the Constitutional Court. So for me, this referendum was put there to create a very good background for Maia Sandu to get re-elected and to associate her figure with the European integration. And it was also probably has fulfilled several other functions to silence the criticism. So the attention will not be focused on her figure, but on the EU integration. And like associating these two, like EU integration and Maia Sandu, means also that if you're criticizing one, you're criticizing the other. If you're criticizing EU integration, you're criticizing Maia, or you're criticizing Maia, you're criticizing European integration. And that kind of provided a very nice context or framework for us to silence some of the opposition coming from the so-called pro-European camp, like from their internal criticism. So that was the context, and they were bragging a lot about that. And I think also that created the context in which at one point the opposition said, like, okay, if you want to do a referendum really about European integration, let's do it. Because they were saying, like the government was arguing that this referendum is crucial, is fundamental, is like everything. The destiny of Moldova will be decided on 20th of October. It's like for decades ahead. You really should understand that there are elections and elections. But this moment, this referendum is really that moment that will generations and generations. It's kind of pathetic rhetoric, but it helped to kind of it also created a context in which the opposition said, like, okay, this is an important moment. Let's play this game. Because if you're associated European integration with everything, and they were really doing that, like they were, for example, doing a lot of corruption schemes. And I'm mentioning corruption because they were saying, like, we are these people that will fight corruption. And they were saying, no, these are like this is also part of the European integration. And they were doing a lot of other things. And for the opposition, was just like what the opposition had to do was just to capitalize on this and kind of saying, like, okay, and also the level of discussion was very primitive. I'm saying that I'm arguing that instead of discussion, we had like they substituted the discussion for a campaign, promotional campaign. Everything was like the EU is the paradise. And the opposition, because if you're arguing at this level of sophistication, then for the opposition, if they would argue, like, if Moldova would join EU, so it means like Moldova will, I don't know, some very sophisticated argument, like Moldova will have investment, and out of this investment will become a technological hub and will create this and this working places. That is an argument. I don't think like the opposition would be able to do a counter narrative that would be as attractive. But they say, like, EU, like the government was going everywhere and say, like, EU is the paradise. EU is this huge market. EU is this, like, once we become part of the EU, everything will be okay. And then the opposition played at the same level. They did not had to be very sophisticated. They were saying, like, in case we're going to EU, it's about gays, it's about like foreigners being able to buy Moldovan lands and will come, and Moldova being forced to adopt and this and that, to adopt migrants, so on. So the level was here because they transformed, they did not start a discussion, but it was a political campaign, basically. And it also, I think, the referendum was not about EU, because technically it was like the question that was put forward was like, do you support, do you agree with the modification of the constitution with the perspective of Moldova joining EU? So it was that. It was not like the government has an obligation or whatever. It's that. So in the end, they succeeded to transform the referendum about themselves. So this was a referendum, but not on some very whatever means this European integration, but about the European integration presented by them as being the paradise on the earth, and also about Maia Sandu and the performance of her presidency and her party in the government. So that's with the government. It was very confused. There was a lot of fear. I think the whole campaign was not only not sophisticated as like political argumentation, but there was also a lot of fear. People were scared. People were told that if they don't vote for yes at this referendum, Moldova will like EU will basically cease, will kind of terminate this agreement of visa-free kind of travel, that migrants that are working in the EU will be sent back, and so on and so forth. So that created also a lot of polarization and got out a lot of people out of fear. And that's also a very huge problem. So I think I covered the referendum.
One small clarification just for our audience too. So can you just describe a little bit about how in Moldova class plays into some of the pro-EU politics? For example, like, how does the Moldovan sort of class play into it? Can you say that those who are more sort of actively campaigning for some of these things like the pro-EU referendum or Maia Sandu sort of belong to a specific social class, while those who might be so-called pro-Russian or not belong to a different one? How do you see class breaking down into this Moldovan politics?
It's not a very clear picture, unfortunately or fortunately, because this is the reality. So I was thinking a lot about who is the constituency in terms of class of Maia Sandu or the opposition, and it's different. Like, for example, 19-something% of people in Gagauzia, in this ethnic autonomy, voted against Maia Sandu and voted against the referendum, which means that basically everyone there, all the classes, like the rich, middle class, everybody voted against. So here we can see the vote split along ethnic lines. Also, in some other parts, you could see kind of a divide where Maia Sandu would be voted more by the younger, and like Stoyanoglu would be voted more by the elderly. But that it's not an age. Here you can put class, because usually Moldovan pensioners are really poor and are living at the limit of their existence. In Chisinau, you could argue that the middle class in a way supports Maia Sandu, because but middle class in Moldova is a really tricky term, because it includes like the traditional middle class, like doctors, whatever, and those would be more likely to vote for Maia Sandu. But there is also this middle class, which is like NGO people and other kind of people that think of themselves as being pro-Europeans and so on. So you could argue that at least in Chisinau, the middle class was more kind of inclined to vote for Maia Sandu. The difficulty comes from the fact that we didn't have exit polls. So, for example, it's really difficult to estimate With the so-called diaspora, it's even more confused because it's a very kind of nebulous, not defined term. So diaspora meanings like Moldovan living abroad. First, you have to have in mind that we have two diasporas, one good and one bad. Like the diaspora that lives in Russia, they were coming to break our European dream, and it was an attack. Like them voting was an attack on democracy. The diaspora in the West, they were realizing their dream, and basically they were helping and saving the country. For them, even like there is no clear class kind of cut distinction, because in a way Maia won overwhelmingly in the Western diaspora, but then it was about the presidency, which president in Moldova is really a ceremonial figure. And in economic terms, like I should say that neither Maia Sandu nor Stoyanoglu were having any kind of position any than pro-business, but really pro-business. So there was no difference between them. So I did not see any kind of, how to put it, attraction, like looking at the economy of one or another, or the social policy of one or another, because they were almost identical. So the diaspora voted overwhelmingly for Maia Sandu, again, all across classes, but mostly because the so-called aspirational class, the people that are kind of living well in the West, and they think that Maia Sandu is this kind of is them as a civilizing agent in Moldova. So basically, it's the diaspora that knows how to do things and came back to Moldova too. But then the other people, like the working class Moldovans that are working in construction or as badante, as care workers in Italy, they voted because they were scared that. They were told, and they were scared, they were told that if the other candidate, like if Stoyanoglu wins, again, like there would be repressions and you might lose your job in Europe. You'll be sent back to Moldova. And people voted based on that. So there was no like something that huge support for whatever, but they were told to vote because otherwise, like they should wait for, they could expect like everything in the relationship between Moldova and EU to change. So it's a very complicated picture. Also because only this middle class is the one that is present in the media and articulates its position. It's very loud. The others are not only not present, but they're also marginalized. It's like really being very harsh in Moldova to be an elderly, to say that you have some needs. There is like their voice is not heard. Sometimes you ask yourself, like you look at the constituency of the parliament, like age of deputies and so on, and you ask like who is representing those people? Who is representing the peasants? Moldova is like almost 60% is a rural country. Who represents those people, for example? The Gagauz, for example, were joking from a liberal perspective, like this second round of elections, Moldova would be a poster case. Like you have a woman and you have a representative of the national minorities. Show me a country where you have this kind of diversity. And but of course the case was different. Like we could see that there was a huge kind of nationalist mobilization against Stoyanoglu as Gagauz, and the Gagauz are also a very underrepresented voice in the local context. So class was present, but not as a kind of clear-cut issue, but mixed and interwoven with other things.
Yeah, that was an excellent breakdown. I think because the working class is not organized in Moldova. They're not a force. They don't have their own interests, nor in Georgia. So they get, sort of split up in different ways. In Georgia, very similar tendencies as well. But it really shows like those who are getting sort of government help, pensioners and sort of below poverty levels are more likely to vote for Georgian Dream, while and also actually workers as well, like traditional workers, state employees are also vote for Georgian Dream. While the more NGO, even workers at NGOs or sort of urban workforce that are more like younger, will be more for the opposition. And so it's similar dynamics. But as far as like, well, we can say, I mean, I'm from the union, and we told everyone we did not feel comfortable endorsing anyone because there's no working class politics. So I was like, unless we get working class party, we refuse to endorse anyone, which made some people mad because they were like, this is an existential, crisis, and why aren't you backing the NGOs, and then the huge trade union confederation also backed the government. So in the organized working class, you can say, to as much as it's the leadership and the working class are one, which is actually not very close, and somewhat close, but also not fully. It was either pro-government or neutrality. There was a couple of like a more cultural workers union and so on that were clearly for the opposition, but also because even the cultural work is dependent on grants, which felt like it was under threat with this NGO law and the sort of anti-Western rhetoric and anti-Western deviation. So at the end of the day, I think the urban middle class, who is very much tied to Western money, they voted in for their interest, what they considered their interest. I don't know if that's actually true. I would disagree with some of it, but really it's because the entire state of Georgia, it's country Georgia, if anyone confuses, is very much funded by foreign money. The state is funded by foreign money, services are funded by foreign money, NGOs are funded by foreign money, the entire system, universities, professors. So really the entire so-called educated, professional class went against the government because they touched their money source, which I found at first like a very confusing strategy. Why would you get the entire middle class of the urban middle class against you right before the election? But actually it worked out. So it shows as well that the ones that the NGOs, because the NGOs, the media, the opposition, whatever, they've all been working together, they're much more organized in their interests than anything working class or any other parts of society. It's really was the government was able to articulate, which was, I would say, working class, sort of lumpen proletariat and big business is like their people, and sort of the precarious middle class, right? Because they're afraid of falling back into the poor parts of Georgia and actually having to work for a wage in one of these, places, and it's not fun. They overwork you and they don't pay you much. So I understand they'd rather have an NGO or be a professor and get some grants and then travel. I mean, I would say it's a pretty, if you're like more high-ranking, professor or sort of head of NGO or something, it's a pretty great life. They're still precarious, in the sense of money, but it's also very nice. I mean, you travel a lot, meet interesting people, you go shopping in, Europe. And so, and then you also your own boss in a lot of ways, you get to determine your own schedule. So of course I understand why they want to keep their privileges. And so this is what really made me think is how, even though we organize workers and do their everyday stuff, like their wages and then, file grievances with the employer and so on, we have never really given a political articulation to workers. We were always so focused on the organizing part. And this is actually my fault, because it's a strategy I believe that would be more correct, that we have to, strengthen and actually provide services for the workers and not be these sort of leftists that type these huge manifestos and then like never be able to even write one grievance or, fight for them. So this sort of like what I thought was how you build up working class. However, if you do not give them a sort of a political media or something to articulate their interests, then somebody else will take the organized people away from you. So I think that was like a big wake-up call in the last few years for me.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. It's the same for us. We understood that we need to do the organizing as a protection, kind of as a defensive barrier for the labor rights and so on. But also we have to think like one level above that, or like to think about real politics, because the power is there. And also this is one of the reasons that I was saying that this geopolitical argument is toxic, or this ethnic argument, this nationalist or cultural conservatism, like, because they're coming and they say like, basically you have to organize based on your ethnic lines, or you're this and you have to hate that guy for his sexual orientation, for what he wears and how he colors his hair and so on and so forth. And we need to think more. But again, I don't, but at the same time, I don't want to beat ourselves too much, because we're like really against much more powerful forces, and it's really difficult. I would totally agree with you that we need to do that, but at the same time, we all know that we are as precarious, and sometimes I feel even more precarious than the workers in a way. Although I'm again in a way privileged, but also more precarious. And I think that we have to understand also this, understand like our rivals, and then to organize accordingly. It's like the optimistic stories that knowing against who you are means like you know who against whom you'll organize. But I think you're totally right that we should think about the articulation of the interest, about like also being a political force, the question of the power. We cannot organize for the sake of organizing. It's because labor rights, they're not this kind of liberal thing that part of something. They're really a political struggle that they were won as a political. It was not a natural consequence of development of the society. Or as we were learning in the 90s, I remember I went to school in Bulgaria. I was studying political science, and there was this nice book by Peter Berger, who later I found that he was an enthusiastic sociologist that would argue against for everything that he perceived as new. So he was mentioning about like this intrinsic relationship between capitalism and democracy, and he was saying that they're so like bring more capitalism and you'll have more democracy, and we should like really unpack this and understand that labor rights are not this. They're not part of this set of rights that come naturally. The rights that were won in the 19th and the 20th centuries that are still being won, it's not like concessions in the sense of like somebody decides to give you this right, you have to fight for them. And we need just to continue that fight, because we were seeing, as with a lot of other rights, we've seen with labor rights, and I think there was this very weird situation that in the post-Soviet countries where you could see a lot of fuss about other rights, like about freedom of speech, which is also important, freedom to organize. But the labor rights were the first attacked, were the first weakened, and they're still being weakened. And this is not perceived as an injustice. It's considered as something like, yeah, it's kind of, it's a necessary thing. It's a barrier or something. And we're losing that. And we should kind of start to fight back, because these are hardly won rights. They affect, and it's like we see how, and that was my original thesis, that like what I wanted to say, that we first saw on the case of labor rights that rights are reversible, and then like the later like freedom of speech restrictions on that, I think everything was first tested on labor rights, and people just gave up labor rights, and then it's like was kind of easier to do the other things. And I'm totally not very comfortable, but then I think this is the realistic assessment in a way. Like rights can be kind of, nothing is irreversible, everything can be reversed, and this is political struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, if you ask, last time there was any polling done of what human rights are most violated in Georgia, it was labor rights, yet no report really reflects that. When the EU says Georgia is violating human rights when it comes to anti-LGBT propaganda laws, and so on, that becomes a red line for them, while labor rights has never been a red line for them. They're not exactly, blackmailing Georgia into complying with labor rights. Unless you do this, we won't let you in. I mean, that's just ridiculous. They never say a comment. I've never heard any single EU member, leader, anyone say something about labor rights ever in my, 10 years that I've been here. So to go back to Moldovan elections. So tell me about the good diaspora. Like, who are these people? Where are they working? Why do they buy into this EU narratives, it seems like, or do they buy into these EU narratives? And why is it sort of the diaspora deciding a lot of the elections internally they don't even live in?
I think it's not just the diaspora. There is some demography behind it. Most of the diaspora is people like my age. I was born in 82, so I would say that people that were born between 1980 and 1990 are the largest demographic group in Moldova. It's just a matter of mathematics. We're the largest group, let's not we, but this is the largest group. It's both within the country and it's both outside the country. After that, Moldova went through a demographic collapse, and there are fewer and still fewer people. And like the other people that are kind of more advanced in age, they're less numerous because of the transition. A lot of people have died and so on and so forth. So it's some demography here. A lot of these people that are working abroad, and it's, how to put it, I would say 80-90% are doing unqualified work, sometimes without working permits. It's very few people, but there is also a large group that went, for example, as Erasmus students and then stayed or went to do some, went with their families when they're of the younger. They went with parents that are my age, but their kids, for example, already were born in Italy and went to school in Italy and kind of are more or less integrated in those societies. And they have a very, very, very kind of distant relationship with Moldova. So they are people of all venues of life. Most of them are doing unqualified work. Now, it's funny in a way, but it's also exemplary how this group was created, was constructed, this social construct of diaspora emerged. Because I remember that before 2009, 2010, everybody was mentioning the international organizations that are politically correct in their languages. They're calling them migrants, Moldovan work migrants, but the government was pejoratively calling them gastarbeiters. So only after 2009, when people, there is also this moment that most of the people, when they left in the 90s, in the 2000s, they went illegally. They did not vote because that meant, for example, for them to appear in the front of Italian police and to say, I'm a Moldovan migrant, I go to vote to this voting station. And they were afraid to just kind of come out as Moldovans. They were very invisible. But then most of them started to legalize their situation. Also, most of them obtained Romanian citizenship, and that made it easier. So they started to participate at the vote in large numbers. And when they started to vote for these so-called pro-European forces, because our political spectrum since 2009 was kind of split along this line, pro-EU and pro-Russian, pro-Soviet Union, pro-whatever. So people started to vote for the so-called pro-European forces, but based on this basic stuff that they are pro-European and they were always advocating for closer relations with the EU. So then they became diaspora. And also you see already when they started to really count, you see some attempts by the government to construct this political concept of diaspora, this political agent is diaspora, and they started to talk about, like, they created this agency, the Bureau of Relationships with the Diaspora. It was created in 2013, I think. And then you see a change in the discourse. So it's not anymore gastarbeiters, it's diaspora. And the diaspora, because they live in the West, they know what is the life there. They're somehow, with their croissant, with their cappuccino, they're also inhaling democracy and freedom and everything. And you have this political agent, and you already had a lot of you could see that Moldovan politicians would go abroad to tour the diaspora. And for these elections, it was very clear, like, the state funded a theater to do shows in some places where Moldovan diaspora is concentrated. Now, like, how they're voting, it's like these presidential elections, I think they're not a good indicator, because the options were some personalities, among which basically there was no difference. I cannot agree, for example, or cannot argue that Maia Sandu is more honest than any of other candidates. It was just like, trust me, and that's it. So I think that, in a way, at the parliamentary elections, it's kind of maybe more visible. But again, that's also it comes with a caveat, because parliamentary, like in Moldova, most of the parties have more or less the same things on the economic program, and they only differ in, like, their geopolitical orientation. So as I say, and that's based on my kind of reading, talking to some people in the diaspora, I have myself, let's say, some close relatives in the diaspora. They vote because they were told, and they are told every time, that their stay there in Europe is under threat if, for example, other forces come to power. So that's their very basic motivation. Like, it was very interesting to see this divide of the public sphere of the country. You go on Instagram or on Facebook, and you have the good diaspora talking about how nice is the life in Europe. But then you go on TikTok, and it's a totally different conversation. You have people living in the EU and saying, like, EU is not your vacation destination. Come here, work 12, 14 hours a day without a working contract. And then you have a kid, you have to dedicate some time to the kid. If you buy a house, you have to pay regularly, buy a car, and so on and so forth. Like, come and see what is the life here. So there were this criticism. But the fact is, like, we in a way don't know our diaspora, because nobody cares about it. Like, the politicians care only for the diaspora to vote. There are not programs to, like, some comprehensive programs to somehow help it in a way. It's just like some festivals, some programs of, like, some holidays and celebrations, and that's it. But there is, like, in a way, diaspora is this subject which is needed around the election. So we don't know it in the sense, like, nobody knows what is the life of these people. You sometimes, like, it was funny to see that people that have voted, for example, for Maia Sandu, which is like, I was following someone on Facebook, on Instagram, on other social media. People that have voted for Maia Sandu have voted also for Donald Trump. And somehow, for me, it was kind of difficult to understand, because one is but because for Moldova, for them, like, Moldova needs to go this way. And I would be really, as a sociologist, I would be really interested to talk to somebody, for example, some communities of religious conservatives who would vote for Maia Sandu, who is this representative of European values, but then they will vote for Trump because traditional values, and because the woke culture and the US, and so on and so forth. So to summarize it, I think the diaspora vote because they are addressed in a very basic, not sophisticated, using very basic arguments, and they're made to believe that if they don't vote, they're blackmailed, basically, or scared, or so. It's maybe that will sound a little bit too harsh, but I'm not referring now to some 3, 4, 10 voices that you can have from the diaspora that are active always on the social media, but like really the tens of thousands that are totally invisible, like my relatives, for example. Like I kind of avoided to talk to my family about politics around these elections because it was really crazy. I could see how this machinery of spreading fear, how it was working. It's like even my family, in a way, like, yeah, we need to save, we need to do that, and they're kind of enthusiasts. They're enthusiastic about this mission of saving the world. And my relatives from the diaspora, they were told, like, you have to vote because otherwise this is what they believed, and they did this trip of several hundred kilometers to vote because that was needed. The country, their motherland, was needing this.
I guess I will ask maybe a final question, is like the sort of the use of Soviet and communist imagery and fears, because our podcast is very much dedicated to that. And so how does the past fuel the present, or the distortions of the past? And can you talk more about that?
As it happens with a lot of my initiatives, I'm good at doing things at a very bad moment. So in 2020, I started this initiative of digitizing books from the Soviet era, because in the Soviet era, we were writing using Cyrillic script. I was digitizing them, and there is a website, and I'm uploading them. And I was really kind of my personal frustration was that the discussion about the Soviet era in Moldova is like sharply divided in two. On the one hand, you have people that say like everything was bad, even mentioning that I had a wedding and I was enjoying that wedding during the Soviet times, some lemonade. That's kind of like that's nostalgia. Everything was bad. Even everything started like as if life was not there. And that there is the other narrative that treats it like radically different and says like everything was only good. So the discussion was kind of distorted, caught between these two extremes. And I wanted to, and most importantly, people were not using like unfortunately, there is this thing that we don't write. There is like the sociologists are not very much interested in this era. Most of the history is anti-communist history. It's like the same party history that was done to justify the regime. Now the historical discipline serves to legitimize and justify the other regime. And I just started to put these things. And then the whole war started. And what we could see, like, my hope was to start and to stimulate a debate around like what was a debate, an intellectual debate. I was very naive, of course, because other actors had other agendas. Now, with the war, like the war swept everything away, because the narrative that was and is still being promoted is that basically Russia is the continuation of the Soviet Union. And the argument was made also before, because when I was arguing that I'm a leftist, that I'm for social equality and so on, I was saying I was called a pro-Russian politician or a pro-Russian activist. And I was asking like, okay, let's take your argument seriously. Like, what is a leftist, socialist, or whatever in Russia? Like, argue, please. Like, tell me what could serve as an inspiration for any reasonable and kind of how to put it, like a respectable leftist. What things in Putinist Russia can you say like really this is my leftist utopia, my anarchist utopia? Of course, there is nothing there. So I think that's the main thing right now with the Soviet past, is being subsumed and put together with the Russian current politics, and is being treated as a whole, and mentioning one mentions another. And it's then after that, a lot of things are possible and a lot of arguments that are absurd are made. But basically you have that Putin is the continuation of the Soviet Union, mentioning in any way Soviet Union, or even trying to discuss in other terms than condemning it, means like transforms you in an apologist for Putin and so on. And in this, we really kind of missed the whole discussion. We didn't have it back then, like before the war. And now the war has really kind of made people uninterested in this discussion. And I still think that it's a very relevant discussion. So, in many ways, also there is the other thing, that anti-communism, but without communism, is this very funny thing, or like not funny, but this kind of paradoxical political ideological construct. You have this anti-communism without communism, and the Soviet Union became in a way necessary. This anti-communism means that everything that is being done in Moldova is being kind of legitimized as like, in case we don't do it, we're going back to the Soviet Union. Any kind of, if you're arguing about like labor rights, you're told that you're a Soviet nostalgia. There is one of the most, I would say, criminal expressions that I've heard was like, we have a Soviet labor code in which it's easier to send the person to prison than to fire it. And like everybody was saying that we need to flexibilize it and so on and so forth. And the anti-communism is like, what is crazy is that it's done now in the absence of any real communist threat, in the sense of, and it's done by the same people, some of them that were very active writing poetry and participating in the ideological apparatus of the Soviet state. And moreover, the Soviet state now and the whole system, this Moldovan communism becomes even more necessary, because it's somehow, it became this explaining or explanatory factory that basically explains everything. So why we're living bad? Because of the Soviet era legacy. Why these people are stealing? Because the Soviets taught them to steal. Why we have this and this situation? Because the Soviets. So as we kind of go more distant in terms of time, and we go more away from that era, it's becoming more necessary to explain things that are happening, and it's becoming more prominent. It's featuring even more in the public discourse, because it's this kind of shadow, and it's kind of gross. It's absurd because it's there. You should leave it there at least, but no, it's being invoked as an excuse for everything. And everything, like even the harshest measures in terms of like social policies, labor policies, are being applied with the excuse that we cannot have that time back. So this is like, in a way, in the absence of a real kind of communist threat, in the absence of a project for the country, anti-communism also functions as a state ideology. Basically, Moldova, which goes like this, like Moldova gained the independence, but the revanchist forces are still there, and our whole project is survive this constant attack by the communist forces. And it's crazy, it's absurd, but this is how the politics here works. So it takes a lot of energy from us, but we do this argumentation, we participate in these debates, and for us it's also a way to clarify some of our standing. But yeah, this is like, as I said, like when we created this platform, we're accused of being Stalinist and nostalgic. Like, no, I'm not. But let's use this as an opportunity to discuss like the state violence and what it means, and where, how it happens, and maybe we have some continuities, because continuities are as interesting as these breaks that supposedly happen. Yeah, and sometimes we say that we are communists and with some passion, and they're writing some pathetic articles like the Marxists are back, and it's like, come on. And some of the people that have been collaborating with the regime back in the 80s, and I'm saying like, I know that you want anti-communist credentials, and you're behaving right now as if I'm the communist censor from that era, but I'm not. So it's ridiculous for you to try now to behave like you should have done that then, when like the regime was. Now we have a different situation. But then it helps. It's one of the big things that helps obscure and kind of sometimes take away the discussion from the necessary things. And let's discuss Soviet camps. Let's discuss Stalin. Let's discuss this and that and that. And then you don't. You cannot discuss economic policy, for example.
I really like the term anti-communism without communists, or anti-communism without communism. And I think what's amazing about that concept is I think that this is something that is actually shared in terms of like a political, ideological, memory, historical dynamic throughout the post-Soviet world. You know, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, these kinds of societies share this dynamic to varying degrees, even in ones that have tried to normalize parts of the Soviet past. And it's something we need to explore together, you know, and think about what its relevance is. But everything you said relates very, very well to the Georgian context. The role of anti-communism as this ideological memory regime. I like to use the term memory regime because it's not simply just an ideological fight, but as you pointed out, it's also a material project of trying to embed and naturalize markets and defeat not just communism that doesn't exist, but remnants, the positive remnants of the Soviet or socialist past, and the potential for those things to guide to a more equal or socialist future, you know? So I totally agree.
Yeah, this anti-communism is being used to discredit any struggle for equality, for social justice, for labor rights, because then it's like it's being showed like, look, you've tried this in the past, it did not work, or like, what do you want to bring us back to that society? And for a lot of, because this is why this is catchy, is because it's very simple. Although there was this very famous joke, you remember that Soviet joke probably about the guy that works in a fridge factory, and his wife is telling him, bring one piece and we'll build a fridge at home. And he was kind of doing that, and whatever he was trying to assemble, in the end he'll get a Kalashnikov. So the same, like we have the same joke in Moldova, like looking at the political parties, how they function, it's really the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So basically, whatever name you put, you attach to the party, whatever, like it's liberal or national or social democratic, in the end, you get a version of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So this is why I said, like, if you talk seriously that Soviet era and you take, for example, some institutional legacies, you'll see much more continuities than like you can see at the surface. And you'd see that I'm making these arguments very often that to a large extent in Moldova, for example, at the level of freedom of speech, political discussion, we are how to put it, perestroika, we're not even at the perestroika level. Perestroika was more free because during the perestroika, you could criticize the head of the state without any risk. That was encouraged. People will read you. And now it's like, no, of course, there is no political repression, but there is other forms of repression. There is economic violence in the sense like you not getting the grant. Like back then, the state was funding the criticism towards the state, which is like really an utopia. We're struggling right now for that, like for subsidies and subventions for the media. That was the thing that was in the perestroika. So I think that discussion is not over. It's still because of the war, because of also, let's face it also, or let's put it also here, because sometimes Putin is also using the Soviet rhetoric, or at least some of the topics of, like, for example, the decolonization and so on. So sometimes it's difficult to have this discussion also because it's not just an intellectual discussion, but I think it's too early to bury it. It's like there I see also a lot of increased interest. It's really funny. There is like the National Archive in Moldova has a web page, and then they post some pictures from that era, and people look, it's like, wow, I thought like in the textbook it was written that everybody was poor in depression. I see here happy people with nice clothes, and it's like, what is this? And we're joking, like 3 or 4 pictures like that, and they were like a whole anti-communist model goes away because people can see also, and there is an increased interest to understand like what was there.
რუგ ვიღაცამ დაიძახა ფეშინა ძმა კაცები ყველანი შეგვაშინა აქ ვიღაცამ დაიძახა აფარდა ჩვენი ფული მილიციას ჩაბარადა აქ ვიღაცამ დაიძახა ქესტუმი და წავაგე კაბარდინის კოსტუმი კამათები გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბარა სხვისი ფული დაქონება სხვამ ჩაიბარა კამათები გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბეში სხვისი ფული დაქონება ჩადის უბეში კამათები გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბარა სხვისი ფული დაქონება სხვამ ჩაიბარა კამათები გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბეში სხვისი ფული დაქონება ჩადის უბეში კუკიაზე ეკლესია რომარი იქ დაკვდება ქურდი ბიჭი ომარი ნახალოკის ომარბაზი რომარი იქ დაკვდება ქურდი ბიჭი ომარი ნახალოკის ომარბაზი რომარი კამათელი გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბარა სხვისი ფული დაქონება სხვამ ჩაიბარა კამათელი გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბეში სხვისი ფული დაქონება ჩამდის უბეში კამათელი გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბარა ჩემი ფული დაქონება სხვამ ჩაიბარა კამათელი გავაგორე დაჯდა დუბეში სხვისი ფული დაქონება ჩადის უბეში